Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Last month, we told you about Republicans' efforts to expand a controversial education program. It would give public money to help more North Carolina parents send their kids to private schools. Today, we're diving deeper into the school choice debate, and we're focusing on school accountability. WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst has been following this debate for years, and she joins us now. Emily, welcome back.
Great to be here.
For listeners who didn't catch our last episode on private school vouchers, give us a quick history.
So North Carolina's private school voucher program, which, when it started out in 2014, was geared mostly toward the lowest income residents in North Carolina. Basically, Republican lawmakers want to expand that program. They want to include families of all income levels. They would basically receive a check to use at a private school of thousands of dollars of public money to be used at a private school. Democrats are opposed to this plan, but Republicans have been able to advance this proposal out of committees, and they're really intent on passing it.
And what are the arguments for and against it?
So Republicans argue this is important because, a common refrain is schools, children aren't one size fits all. You can't just offer the exact same thing to every child. And, some people just don't like the school that they go to and they would like to go to a different school. And they argue there's not enough choice for families. So Democrats argue that's not true. There are tons of magnet schools and all kinds of different choice schools all across North Carolina that students can apply to that are public schools. Charter schools exist. And, they argue that diverting public money to private schools, would potentially harm public schools by making them cut costs.
And part of the argument against the plan has been that there's no way to tell if these private schools are any good, right?
Right. So basically when a student receives a voucher to go to a private school, they still have to, take tests and things like that at the private school. Private schools do nationally standardized tests. Those scores are kept on file for potential review by the state annually, but none of that is published publicly. And there's no mechanism for if the scores were bad, that the state would then decide, you can't use vouchers anymore. Your scores aren't good enough. There's no, mechanism of control there.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about accountability for private schools in the state. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst about a Republican effort to expand the state's private school voucher program. Emily, before the break, you talked about how opponents of this plan say there's little accountability for private schools. What do we know about their performance?
So we don't know a ton because the students who take tests at those private schools, they might only take nationally standardized tests. They don't take the state standardized tests. So even if we had testing data publicly available, it wouldn't be comparable to what the public school students take. So there have been a couple of studies in North Carolina, basically NC State researchers wanted to find out, how well students were doing, and they kind of polled students voluntarily, who were using vouchers and tried to make a comparison. It's not, your gold standard study. They found kind of mixed results, some better test scores, but a lot of people have been skeptical of those studies, that they're still not a true comparison because you're not using the same tests, and it was more of a voluntary participation versus a randomized sample of students. So we don't know a ton. We have some information about how programs have worked in other states, but every state also kind of sets up their programs a little bit differently. So they're not all totally, apples to apples.
Well, what about accreditation? Are there outside agencies that can give a seal of approval?
Yes, so something that is generally true across the country, most private schools are accredited. So basically what that means is an outside agency has come into the school, they've reviewed curricula, they've done focus groups, they've talked with teachers and administrators and done a thorough review of, how that school teaches, and they've given their seal of approval for it. There are a ton of different accrediting agencies out there. Some are really focused on being affiliated with certain religious schools, a Baptist school, a Catholic school. And so we do know generally that most private schools are accredited. In North Carolina, private schools are not required to be accredited, even if they participate in the voucher program. That's actually kind of unusual because in a lot of states, they do require accreditation because basically those states say, hey, you're using public money. And so we want at least some entity has given their seal of approval. They've said that the curriculum that you're using is solid. They're getting generally a good impression of how you run the school. So that's how accreditation works. But in North Carolina, we just don't have a lot of information on who is accredited. It's just not easy to find out. There are, in theory, plenty of schools that aren't accredited. We don't really know if they're receiving voucher money or not.
Republicans say there's also accountability in the free market, right?
Yeah, so the argument, when they've had committee meetings about this voucher expansion, one of the arguments a lot of Democratic lawmakers have made is there's no accountability for these schools. Public schools are subject to all kinds of accountability for receiving public funds, but these private schools are receiving public funds and then not subject to accountability. So the response from Republican lawmakers has really been, this is a voluntary program, and if people don't like it, if they go to a school, they don't think the school is doing a good job, they'll just leave.
And one would think that private schools would be motivated to measure performance so that they can make that sales pitch to parents. It's tough to compete against a free public education. They really need to sell themselves as an investment, right?
Sure. Private schools do advertise, they do, market to families. And, a lot of them might use a statistic. They might say, if they're a high school, they might say, X percent of our students get accepted into four-year universities. But it's really kind of all up to the private school. It's what statistic they want to share, how they want to market their school to families, or perhaps the school is, a lower level. Maybe they're more focused on different types of education, maybe a different method of teaching, and they really want to market themselves as being different in that way. So, but that's really going to be up to the school. They're privately run. They can do things a little differently, and so they're going to market themselves a little bit differently.
What do the experts say? Should states evaluate how private schools perform, and if so, how?
So there's kind of a mixed opinion on that. I talked to a researcher who's very much in favor of private school vouchers. He wants them to expand, across the country. He really, believes in them as a choice for families. He thinks they have enough positive impacts on, just how the families feel about their education at the very least, that he really supports them. But he's also said, you should really require require all of these voucher receiving private schools to be accredited because it's such a thorough review. It's an endorsement of the school. And one thing that he said is a lot of private schools would rather be subject to that than to testing accountability. So then I talked to another researcher who's very opposed to private school vouchers, and he's more interested in the testing accountability because he thinks that's a much more direct comparison. Even if they're using different tests, you're unlikely to score well on the ACT and poorly on the SAT. So he thinks even if they're different tests, you can still get a solid understanding of, okay, people are reading on grade level at this school, and that's a much clearer indication of success than, an outside agency just accrediting a school.
Is there any room for compromise in how these schools are held accountable? Will anything come from this debate?
So what we've seen in other states is there has been room for compromise on a lot of these things. When they established a voucher program, they required accreditation, or in some places they actually did require state standardized tests. And there's still some debate, especially on the testing front, about whether to include that. So we've seen that in other states, but in North Carolina, there's not really a conversation about it right now. You have a lot of Democratic lawmakers who are saying, we really need some level of accountability, and there are Republican lawmakers who just have a response to that every time, saying, this is about free market accountability. People can simply choose not to go to these schools if they don't want to. And, the conversation just kind of ends there. It does not seem that there's room for compromise right now in North Carolina on this topic.
Well, if there is any change, we know you'll be watching and we know you'll be reporting on it. Thanks, Emily.
Absolutely.
That's WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst. For her in-depth coverage of the school voucher debate, visit the education section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.